You can look at the deer and elk, the antelope, everything down the chain is affected by overgrazing.
This is Troy Couture, a second-generation contractor for the Bureau of Land Management. And he's not talking about cattle grazing. He's talking about habitat damage done by free-roaming burros and horses.
You have to maintain certain numbers at certain places, or pretty quick there's nothing alive. And the horse and the donkey will be the last thing that goes because they're the biggest, strongest. They're just so overrun.
When the BLM needs to gather wild horses or burros, Couture handles the job more often than not. And gathering just means herding horses and burros from public and private lands and moving them off-range.
It's so much easier to go to a job that we're all fat, they're all healthy, they're easier to handle.
All of Couture's work, all these gathers, are necessary because of some simple math. There are way too many horses and burros out west, and not enough habitat to support them.
We go to a place and they're thin, they're just dying poor thin, so you're catching them. You don't know when the last time they had a drink is when they come in, and they're poor, and people don't see that. I see it. I drove out and seen the one that wouldn't move from the helicopter, or we'd ride up to the horseback, and it won't move. He's past the point of getting him in a trailer. He's just waiting for the next place to lay down and die. And it's probably going to be right where he's standing.
I'm Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs, and this spring I went to Northwest Arizona where Couture and his crew gathered roughly 1,100 wild burros from the Black Mountains. That was just one gather in a historic year for the BLM.
The Bureau of Land Management is in the process of capturing and removing more wild horses and burros from the West than ever before.
In January, the BLM announced plans to gather at least 22,000 wild horses and burros from overpopulated Western herds in 2022. Animal rights activists are furious, and they want the horses to just be left alone. But more than 30 hunting and conservation organizations support the gathers.
And until a person sees that kind of stuff, you're like, oh yeah, just let them die on range. That's nature's way. No. We as people are supposed to maintain healthy herds and healthy animals.
Couture is talking about the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act, which was signed by President Nixon back in 1971. It charges the BLM with managing wild horses and burros on public land. They have to protect the horses and burros from harm while also managing BLM land for multiple uses.
I'm pleased that for the first time in 15 years, we've had a downturn in numbers over the last 2 years, 2 years in a row. Mm-hmm. That curve is not bending fast enough for the health of the horses or the health of the landscape, but it's bending.
This is Tracy Stone Manning, the director of the Bureau of Land Management. I spoke with her this spring about the historic plan to gather so many horses and burros.
For this issue and for any issue that comes before us, for me, the North Star is the health of the landscape. And so if we're managing for the health of the landscape, we get a lot of things answered for us, right? And one of the answers are there are way too many horses on the landscape. There are 3.5 times the numbers that are the appropriate management levels that are set. And so that's just not tenable, right? It's not tenable for wildlife. It's not tenable for healthy grasslands, and it's not tenable for the horses.
The BLM is supposed to maintain fewer than 27,000 free-roaming burros and horses across 177 herd management areas. So meeting that threshold is basically like chasing a mirage. They've never been able to reach it. In 2020, herds numbered 95,000. But those are just BLM-managed horses. There are actually an estimated 280,000 wild horses and burros in the U.S. A lot of them, 117,000, are on tribal lands. Also, it's a common misconception that wild horses and burros live in grasslands. They're primarily found in desert ecosystems, which are already fragile and subject to high competition for resources like forage and water. And that's not to mention the giant mega drought that the West is dealing with.
And as drought continues on the landscape, it's only going to get worse and harder. So I'm interested in staunching it as much as we can now, and really interested in finding a long-term solution through fertility controls. At the moment, the fertility control that we've used the most is it only lasts a year or two. So we needed like a gazillion volunteers on the landscape who are trained to dart mares in the butt with, year after year. And those are the ones we can get to. So that's not tenable. It's helpful, but it's not the long-term solution. And so that's why we did earlier in the year did a request for proposals from the scientific community on, hey man, help us find this long-term solution. And then until then, we continue to do gathers, and we are focusing those gather, and we've got a gather schedule, which I expect will be derailed by emergency gathers as the drought gets worse.
BLM has been dealt a really tough hand.
This is Kevin Hurley, a former Wyoming wildlife biologist and the current vice president of conservation for the Wild Sheep Foundation. The Black Mountains, by the way, are home to the largest bighorn sheep herd on U.S. public land.
And being a 45-year wildlife biologist, we've lived and breathed by management by objective. Well, I think Congress established the objective in 1971. And so one of the questions I have always is, when the appropriate management level was established 50 years ago, then look what's happened to habitats, water availability, changing climates, etc. If there was going to be a recalculation of AML now, I don't think it would be 27,000 like it was set 51 years ago. And so...
You think it would be lower, is your guess?
Oh, absolutely. And how long is it going to take? If you could suspend all horse and burro grazing right now, how many years would it take to recover in these arid, pounded habitats that don't have water to start with? If you added up all the biomass, all the weights of the horses and burros in Nevada, and added up the biomass or weights of all the elk, deer, moose, bighorn sheep, pronghorn, all the big game ungulates, there's way more horse and burro poundage on the landscape than all the big game in Nevada combined.
Hurley is citing the work of Nevada bighorn and mountain goat wildlife biologist Mike Cox, who keeps close tabs on this.
And I think for hunters that are interested in the spectrum of critters from deer to pronghorn to moose to elk to sheep, that's a pretty startling fact that there's more poundage of horse and burro on the Nevada landscape than there is native big game. That ought to concern the hell out of people. BLM has an objective of AML, but their hands are being tied by the courts and by the activists and the advocates that every time there's a gather, somebody, some do-gooder, files a lawsuit or seeks a preliminary injunction. And so here's an important point. I always hear from the horse people that say, well, if you just got rid of all the domestic cattle and sheep on public land grazing allotments, there'd be that much more forage available for horses and burros and native ungulates. And okay, well, if you believe in the multiple use philosophy over Western public lands, there's no rancher that gets to run as many cows out there, or cow-calf pairs, or yearlings, or whatever. Permittees are all held to time and numbers and duration and frequency, and horses and burros are not. Big game hunting season, if you have too many elk and they're causing damage to some rancher's haystack, or they're, camped out on, not that you get elk on golf courses, but bighorn sheep damn sure go on golf courses that live down around Palm Springs. Hell, there's green feed right there and water. And so my point is that big game is managed. Livestock are managed. Horses and burros, pretty much unmanaged. And it's because of the courts, and it's because of the activists and the advocates. Nobody wants to see thousands of animals starving and dying in a trumped out water hole in the desert. But that's going to happen. And when that does, I think everybody that said, don't touch them, don't gather them, don't remove them, don't manage them, that's on them.
More than 100 horses were found dead, drowned in the thick mud surrounding a dried-up watering hole on the Navajo Nation. The images, some of the most alarming we've seen of the drought so far.
This is actually a news clip from 2018. It happened a few months after the Navajo Nation Department of Fish and Wildlife tried to hold a hunt to remove just 60 horses from mountains in northeast Arizona. The NNDFW was concerned about the horses' impact on mule deer. But the management hunt was canceled less than a week later due to protests. Protesters are common at gathers, especially if there's a helicopter involved. But Couture says that they weren't that bad at the Black Mountain Gather this spring.
Really lucky on this burro job because we only had them there the first 4 or 5 days. And they don't affect me really, but it kind of affects the whole crew because when you got a camera sticking at you all day long, every day, I mean, it eats to you a little bit, you know. Like we just finished that job there. It was 1,100 head, just over 1,100 head. And we had absolutely no death loss on that job. So I'm pretty proud of that. To do 1,100, any kind of gather for 1,100 head, I don't care if it's gentle cows or gentle horses. We had nothing we put down and not a single death. Just all they're doing is a hired camera, really, to try to get something stopped that has to be done.
One of the latest attempts to reduce the BLM's ability to gather horses is a bill introduced by a congresswoman in Nevada, which is ironic because Nevada is home to 65% of the BLM's wild horses. The bill proposes to end helicopter use in gathers. Opponents and animal rights activists say they're inhumane.
And anybody that thinks, it's so much better to catch them other ways, don't have a clue what they're talking about. All they want to do is get that job shut down so they can't be caught. Sure. When I was a little kid, we didn't use helicopter. We did it on horseback. And they went months to catch a few hundred. I mean, we could be 2 miles away from looking from them from the air. I mean, our pilots do it all the time. And then when they start making the wrong turn or going the wrong way, he just eases down there and makes a turn on them and gets away from them again. So the helicopter is the only time the helicopter is directly on them is when all these media see it because they're right at the trap. They're right at the trap seeing the last push going in the gate. And to get them in the gate, you have to make that last push, and you got to go ahead and push them in there. And that is actually the only time them horses would lope or run that you're doing the gather, except maybe when you made your first turn, you went out to that group of horses and you before you got control of them, you made a couple turns on them.
While injuries do happen on gathers, they're rare. Most euthanizations are the result of a pre-existing condition that the horse developed on the range. When I counted in June, of the 4,378 animals that had been gathered in 2022 so far, just 11 died from gather-related causes. That's a fatality rate of 0.02%. When something does go wrong, it's easy for activists to paint a contractor like Couture as a mercenary. Right, he's hired to remove horses from their range, pocket the check, and move on to the next herd. But in reality, most contractors and BLM horse and burro program employees are lifelong horsemen and women.
My family's, we've all rodeoed. I mean, I rode bucking horses for a living for several years. I've been to every pro rodeo across the country riding bucking horses. I junior rodeoed all through it. My kids junior rodeo. I've had $100,000 barrel horses and $50,000 rope horses. You know, they're our life. Horses are my whole family's life. So when someone says they don't care about them, I've doctored baby colts, hundreds of them, thousands of them. You know, I've bottle fed them. Anything we can do to maintain them, keep them going, and keep them healthy.
We'll be right back. Here's one of the big reasons horses and burros are so out of control. Wild horses and burros aren't wild at all. They're feral. Wild is a term biologists reserve for species that have never been domesticated. The last native horse roamed North America roughly 10,000 years ago, along with megafauna like saber-toothed cats and giant ground sloths. The burros in the Black Mountains are feral descendants of North African wild asses, brought to the Black Mountains by miners and prospectors in the 1860s. Spanish horses arrived with the conquistadors in the late 1400s. It's also why they don't have consistent natural predators.
There are some cougars that are very good at hunting horses and burros. They're specialists.
This is Dr. Terry Messmer, a wildlands resources professor at Utah State University.
They'll, take out foals, things along that line, but they're not distributed widely enough, and there's not enough of them. They don't exist in the same habitats where they can actually affect the control on the population. They will take horses incidental. In some cases, they will specialize them during seasons of the year, but it's not their predominant native prey base, and they're not going to be able to regulate a population. But then the problem becomes, Natalie, when you remove those animals and you can't adopt them or they can't be sold, what do you do with them? And so right now that's the dilemma with the program is 2/3 of the program budget goes to manage those horses that have been taken off range.
The BLM's Wild Horse and Burro program received a record high budget of $151.6 million in 2022. That's a 31% increase over last year's. And Dr. Messmer is right. 2/3 of that is spent maintaining the roughly 58,000 horses and burros that are in off-range care. That's nearly $50,000 to keep a horse during its lifetime. And that's in a normal year. Hay prices tripled this summer due to drought and inflation.
One of the problems we have, Natalie, is most folks are unaware that they exist. And even in states where we've got fairly large populations, such as, Nevada's got 60 herd management areas, 60% of the residents of Nevada that really weren't aware that they had wild horse and burro populations in Nevada.
Dr. Messmer says that public education is key to tackling our management problem, because the people who do know about horses and burros out west have strong opinions on them. And a lot of the times, that's not getting us any closer to a long-term solution.
The surveys that we've done suggest that the public does not like the idea of euthanasia. In other words, going out on the range where we've got populations that are in trouble and actually euthanizing those animals. The public is not supportive of that. And so, Natalie, that's something that's probably not part of the BLM's toolkit right now. So if we do a removal or a gather, then we have horses. If we can adopt those horses out and we can find suitable homes for them, and the BLM has done a great job. This last year there were over 8,000 animals placed. But when you're taking off 20,000 animals and you're placing 8, that means that you got another 12,000 you have to put in long-term holding. And so they're trying to be creative. I mean, part of this is they're looking at engaging stakeholders to talk about what can we do about increasing adoption.
One of those creative solutions is a cash incentive. So if you're a qualified adopter who's approved to adopt a BLM horse or burro this year, you get $1,000 cash.
And so then, Natalie, we come down to the if you will, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that's fertility control. There are a lot of volunteers, and in areas where we've got a closed population, Natalie, in other words, where we know those horses, they're not moving in and out, we can identify them by facial markings or coloration, and we can treat a good part of the population with the use of immunocontraceptives. That works fantastic. But if you're talking at a herd management area where it's an open population, where you've got animals moving in and out from surrounding areas.
Messmer is talking about wild horses and burros meeting up with other herds of wild horses and burros, but he's also talking about animals that are domesticated and have been turned out by their owners because they can't afford or they don't want to take care of their animal anymore. He says that there's actually a very small percentage of the original Spanish Mustang genetics in the BLM herds.
And it's expansive. It's hundreds of thousands of acres. The idea of darting and achieving, 70% inoculation rate in a population like that, Natalie, it's not possible. It's not possible. And so that brings up other mechanisms. Well, okay, if we cannot use a vaccine, what about the idea of using IUDs?
The amount of money and logistics this kind of fertility control would take to actually make a dent in wild horse and burro populations out west is astronomical. So it's easy to see why land managers, ranchers, hunters, wildlife biologists are really frustrated that there's not a more economical and efficient way to tackle this.
In my opinion, it would be a tragedy if America no longer had wild horses.
This is Arm von Benedict. He's a rancher, a cowboy, a backcountry hunter, and an outdoor life contributor.
Burros, I don't connect them with the heritage of America. But I like burros too, and I don't mind them. It does make me a little bit ill when I see what they do to the landscape, especially at the cost of native wildlife. If we were to eliminate them, wild horses and burros from the American landscape, it would solve a lot of problems. But it would be closing the door on a piece of history and a way of life that's been part of America ever since, very shortly after white folks arrived here,
When Arm and I spoke at his ranch in northwest Arizona this spring, not far from where the Black Mountain burros were gathered, he said you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who loves horses more than him. He's even owned BLM-adopted Mustangs, and he still sees a need for some kind of humane lethal management.
The Wild Horse and Burro Act is a fairly crippling law. It kind of handcuffs everything involved. There's a lot worse things than a quick death. There really are. And honestly, most wild horses that die in nature are going to suffer far more than they would in a trip to the dog food factory. Nobody wants to hear that, but it's the plain truth. Nature kills with vicious cruelty, and humans typically do what we can to mitigate miserable deaths and to reduce that, to make it as quick and as humane as possible. I don't think you'll ever find a way for America to hunt wild horses. But burros, I think you might. I feel like horses are seen more as a member of the human family. But I think there's a fair amount of hunters that would say, sure, I'll shoot a burro. Let's see how he tastes.
This episode of the Outdoor Life podcast was reported, edited, and produced by me, Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs. The news clip was an excerpt from KJZZ. The music in this episode was by Simon Brown via APM Music.